I'm Don. In this episode, we're going to look at basic camera functions. This is a basic DSLR, digital single lens reflex camera. It has so many buttons and whistles on here. It's got dials over here, buttons over here, another dial on the top. I'm sure there's a button on here that lets me start my car, but I haven't found it yet, so I'm sure it's in there. But what I want to do today is compare what we can do with this as opposed to the camera I bought in 1977, an old Nikon manual focus, manual exposure camera. So this being Nikon, this is a Nikon FM, brought out in 1977, fully manual, manual exposure, manual focus, and everything that you can do in this camera, you can do in Nikon's cheapest DSLR. So today what I want to do is, using this manual camera, I'm going to break it down and show you the bare essentials of what photography is. And this is the perfect camera to do it because there's no electronics in this camera except for a little exposure meter in the top here. And we'll get to that in a minute. So let's start at the front. We're going to talk about the lens. What does a lens do? A lens primarily focuses the light coming from the outside world, focuses it onto the film plane of the camera. That's its main job, but it also has a secondary function, and that's the aperture. And if I hold the lens like this and turn the aperture ring, you can actually see the aperture getting smaller and bigger. And what that does is controls your depth of field. Now this is one of the things that drives people crazy about photography. What is depth of field? It's very simply a matter of determining how much area in your picture you want in focus. With a large aperture like this on a lens and certain other factors, you can get very shallow depth of field. In other words, if you're looking from here and your camera's pointing here, you can get something from here to here in focus. With a small aperture like this, then you're getting a large depth of field, lots of things in focus, and that's all it does. So another thing the aperture does in the lens is it actually allows a certain quantity of light to go through the lens and into the camera. As you can see here, the lens is wide open, so you're getting a large amount of light coming through the lens and hitting the film plane. And as I get the hole smaller, it actually lessens the amount of light hitting the sensor in your camera or film as in the older days. So that's two functions that the aperture does. Depth of field by controlling how big the aperture is, and again, how much light comes through the lens by controlling how big the aperture is. So now that we've talked about aperture, or now that we've talked about lenses and the aperture and how much that lets an amount of light come in, it's a whole bunch of light at once or it's a little bit of light, we'll talk about the camera body. The camera body was designed to hold a film in a light-tight environment. Even with no lens on the camera, the film isn't exposed because there's a mirror and a shutter in the way. I want to talk about the shutter. What the shutter does is limits the amount of time that the light hits the film. And the shutter is controlled by the shutter speed dial. You can have shutter speeds, even from 1977, this old camera, 1/1000th of a second, which is really, really fast, down to 1 second. And bulb, which you can just hold it open forever and ever and ever. So with today's modern cameras and all the bells and whistles and buttons and gadgets and things you can attach to them, it does exactly the same thing as this camera here. It has aperture in the lens, but unfortunately there's no button on this camera to control it. It's controlled electronically through a dial somewhere. So it's a little harder to access, but it does exactly the same thing. So there's three things that control basic camera functions. First is your aperture, which opens and closes to allow a certain amount of light through the lens. The second is a shutter speed that controls the time that amount of light hits the film or sensor. And film or sensor, your ISO, controls how sensitive the sensor or the film is.